She was thrown away like garbage by the people she once served. And yet it was a man they called less than human who showed her what it meant to truly belong. The torchlight licked the night sky, casting long shadows on faces that once smiled at her in church pews and market stalls. Eloise stood still as the rope dug into her wrists, tied tight against the wooden post in the center of the square. Her dress, once blue, now clung to her in tatters, soaked with mud and torn where rough hands had pulled at it. Her hair hung in clumps over her face, sticky from the tar they'd smeared down her back like punishment. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd already cried every tear the night she screamed, and no one came. The crowd pressed in, voices sharp with laughter and judgment, some angry, some excited, like they'd waited years for a reason to throw stones at someone they thought was too quiet, too proud, too strange. They called her names as they hurled feathers at her, sticking to the tar, clinging like shame. A boy she used to teach his letters threw a handful of corn husks at her head. His mother didn't stop him. The preacher stood watching, lips thin, eyes shining like he believed this was justice. His son, the real villain, was nowhere in sight. She had spoken out. She had told the truth, that he'd followed her down the back alley after Sunday meeting, that he'd grabbed her, whispered filth into her ear, and pushed her to the ground. Her voice had been shaking when she confessed to the sheriff. But the town didn't want a scandal. They wanted quiet. They wanted her gone. "You're lucky we're merciful," someone shouted, spitting near her feet. "Witches used to hang for less." A group of men unlatched the ropes and dragged her through the dirt road leading to the edge of Ash Hollow. Each step felt heavier, tar drying on her skin, cracking with every movement. Her bare feet scraped against rocks and gravel. She didn't beg, didn't scream. What would have been the point? Mercy had never lived in this town, only the illusion of it. At the border, past the old gate where the wooden sign read, "All are welcome who fear the Lord," they threw her down. One of them tossed a ragged sack at her. Inside was a crust of bread, a dented canteen, and a blanket too thin to keep out the night. "You show your face again, you won't leave walking," one man growled, before turning back toward the town. They left her there, alone in the dark, the taste of ash on her tongue. The wind howled through the trees like it mourned something no one else would. Eloise sat up slowly, every muscle aching, every breath sharp. She pulled the blanket around her, sticky feathers still clinging to her arms, and stared down the long stretch of prairie before her. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she couldn't go back. Not ever. Behind her, Ash Hollow glowed in the dark like a sickness, like something that had spit her out and moved on. She stood, shaky but upright, and took her first step away from the place that had broken her. And though her body felt like ruin, something deep inside her, small, quiet, but alive, refused to die. The sun showed no kindness. It burned her skin raw, turned her lips to cracked leather, and left her tongue thick like cotton in her mouth. The wind offered no relief, just more dust that clung to the tar still dried along her back. Her arms hung heavy at her sides, her legs shaking with each step as she followed the sound of running water. It teased her at first, whispering through the brush, then faded, then returned louder, until finally she stumbled into a clearing and saw it. A narrow stream, shallow but clear, winding through smooth stones like a ribbon of salvation. She dropped to her knees before she reached it, collapsing face first into the soft earth at its edge. The world slipped sideways, her vision swimming, her limbs refusing to move. She thought she might die right there, half covered in feathers and dirt, with the sun setting behind her, and no one to care. She didn't even feel the shadow when it first fell over her, only noticed the change in light, the cooler air, the crunch of cautious footsteps. Her breath caught, and her fingers twitched toward the sack at her side, but there was no strength left in them. She opened her eyes slowly, the world too bright to make sense of, and blinked against the shapes that stood above her. At first, she thought it was a dream, the way the figure knelt beside her without a word. Not a preacher, not a sheriff, not a man from Ash Hollow. His skin was darker than hers, but not dark enough for the town to call him Apache. His features sharp, but his eyes soft, Caught between two worlds, she would learn later, welcome in neither. He held out a canteen, uncapped, the metal catching the light. When she flinched, he didn't speak, didn't force it into her hands, just placed it on a rock beside her and backed away. His movements were slow, careful, like someone who had known the weight of another person's fear. She watched him through heavy lashes, unsure if she should trust, unsure if she even could. Then her stomach turned, twisting itself in pain, and a sob slipped from her throat before she could stop it. Not loud, just enough to break the silence, and something in his face changed. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't ask what happened or where she came from. He simply unrolled a blanket beside the stream, close enough to be near if she needed him, far enough to give her space. She drank the water with trembling hands, some of it spilling down her chin, and when she looked back toward him, he was already seated cross-legged on the other side of the fire pit, tearing a piece of flatbread in half. He tossed one side toward her gently, letting it land near her feet. She stared at it a long moment, unsure what to make of this quiet stranger. Then hunger took over, and she ate it like it might be the last food she'd ever taste. The man didn't smile, didn't ask for thanks. He watched the sky instead, as if waiting for it to decide something. And Eloise, weak and raw and still feathered like a broken bird, curled beneath the thin blanket and stared at him through the fading light. She didn't know his name, didn't know what he wanted. But he hadn't looked away, and in that moment, that was more than anyone else had done. The next morning, Eloise woke with her face pressed to the dirt, the scent of smoke and ash still hanging in the air. The blanket had slipped off her shoulders sometime during the night, and the cool dawn left her arms covered in gooseflesh. She sat up slowly, her muscles sore, her lips still cracked, but the world no longer spun when she opened her eyes. Across the fire pit, Jonas knelt by the stream, washing his hands. His movements were quiet, careful, like everything he did was shaped by patience. She hadn't heard him speak yet, hadn't even known if he could, but something in the way he looked at her said more than words could. He nodded once when he noticed her awake, then stood, picked up a small satchel, and began walking. She didn't ask where they were going. She simply stood, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and followed. They moved slow at first, her feet still raw from the days before, but he adjusted his pace without saying anything. Not once did he look back with impatience. If she stumbled, he paused. If she winced, he stopped to rest. The silence between them never felt empty, only necessary, like speaking might shatter something too fragile to name. They traveled until the sun hovered low, and then he found a patch of dry grass beneath a cluster of cottonwoods. He gathered sticks and built a fire. She watched him strike flint against steel with practiced ease, sparks catching like they were meant to. Later, he handed her a flat rock with thin slices of roasted rabbit. The meat was tough but warm, and she ate slowly, her eyes watching him from across the flames. He didn't eat until she did. When she finally asked his name, her voice barely above a whisper, he didn't hesitate. "Jonas," he said simply. She nodded once, then looked down at her hands, stained with ash and tar that still clung to her skin no matter how much she scrubbed at the stream. He didn't ask for hers. Maybe he already knew it didn't matter. By the third day, he began showing her things, not in the way a teacher would, but like a man who'd learned things through living, and didn't believe in hoarding what he knew. He pointed to certain plants and shook his head, then touched others and gave a single word: edible, tea, poison. He showed her how to tie snares, how to track fresh prints, how to move without snapping twigs beneath her boots. She watched closely, fingers fumbling at first, then slowly growing steady. When she finally asked why he helped her, her voice shook. Not from fear, but confusion. No one had helped her before, not without expecting something in return. He didn't look up from the rabbit he was skinning, didn't even pause his hands. "You looked like someone who'd been thrown away," he said, his voice low and even. Eloise blinked, unsure how to answer that. She looked down at the fire, watched the flames curl around the blackened wood, and realized she hadn't thought of Ash Hollow once that day. Not until now. The cliffs rose high around them, red and gold against the morning light, casting long shadows across the narrow path that led into the camp. Jonas didn't say much as they approached, only glanced back once to be sure Eloise followed close. She did, quiet and alert, her fingers curled around the strap of her satchel, her eyes scanning faces as they passed. The people there didn't stare exactly, but they looked long. Some nodded to Jonas, others barely acknowledged him at all. A few turned their backs. It wasn't a big camp, just a few lodges scattered near a spring that trickled from a crack in the stone. Smoke drifted from cooking fires, and the scent of roasted maize and boiled roots filled the air. Children played with sticks near the edge, kicking dust into the wind, their laughter sharp and sudden, like the crack of twigs underfoot. One boy, maybe 9, stopped when Jonas passed. His eyes narrowed, his mouth twisted into something cruel, and he muttered a word in English that hit like a slap. Eloise didn't understand at first. She only saw how Jonas flinched, how his shoulders tensed, and his jaw clenched tight enough to grind bone. The boy spat the word again, louder this time, and some of the women nearby hushed him, pulling him back by the collar. But the damage had already been done. Jonas didn't speak. He didn't look at the boy. He just kept walking toward a small lodge near the back of the camp, his steps heavy now, like each one cost more than it should. Eloise followed, her heart thudding harder than it had during any of the long nights on the trail. She hadn't seen him shrink like that before, not even when they passed armed riders or watched buzzards circle over abandoned wagons. He always walked like the ground knew him, like he belonged to it in a way others didn't. But not here, not now. They settled by a fire pit behind the lodge. Jonas crouched low, arranging kindling even though there was no need to light anything. The sun was still warm, and the smoke from other fires drifted close enough to share heat. Eloise sat across from him, legs tucked under her, watching him with care. He still didn't speak, just placed each stick with slow, precise hands, as if order could protect him from whatever he'd felt back there. She waited until the quiet stretched too long, until the ache of it settled behind her ribs. "Your name," she said gently. "What does it mean?" He didn't answer at first. Then, finally, he muttered, "Doesn't matter. It don't belong to one side or the other." "Is that why he said that to you?" His shoulders rose, then fell. "My mother was Apache. My father was white. He called her his property, beat her when she tried to run, took me after she died, raised me to hate everything she gave me." Eloise's breath caught. The fire pit between them felt cold suddenly. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then maybe the world never deserved you in the first place." He looked up at her, finally, and the firelight flickered across his face. His eyes didn't shine from anger. They shimmered with something soft and broken, and so deep it made her chest ache to see it. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. And for the first time since they'd met, she saw him not just as a man surviving, but as one who had once hoped for a place to belong. And maybe, just maybe, had found the beginning of it here. The leather smelled strong, earthy, like rain-drenched bark or the inside of an old barn. Jonas laid it across her lap, smoothed it with his palms, then handed her a bone needle and a strip of sinew. He didn't speak much, just guided her hands with his own, showing her how to loop and pull, how to keep the tension steady so the stitch held tight but didn't tear. Eloise sat cross-legged on a blanket, her knees brushing his, the fire crackling low beside them as dusk curled in around the camp. Her fingers trembled at first, not from fear but from the unfamiliar calm. So long she had lived with her body braced, shoulders high, fists clenched, ready for insult or blow. But now, there was no yelling, no hands grabbing her wrist, no glares from church windows or cold whispers behind her back. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the rhythmic pull of sinew through skin. She poked her thumb by accident, the small bead of blood surprising her, and Jonas reached without thinking, catching her hand in his. He didn't say anything, just turned her palm toward the firelight, pressing his thumb gently against hers until the bleeding stopped. Then, he let go. No lingering touch, No look that asked for something in return, just quiet respect. The needle slipped through again, and the stitch began to take shape, crooked but whole. Eloise watched her own hands move, hesitant at first, then steadier, and felt something stir deep in her chest. She remembered how her mother used to hum as she sewed dresses in their tiny home outside Ash Hollow, before the sickness came, before the preacher warned that beauty could be sinful, before people whispered that a woman too skilled with her hands might be working the devil's magic. Her mother never listened to such talk. She would brush Eloise's hair and say, "What these hands make, they own. No one can take that." It had been years since Eloise touched a needle. Her stepmother burned all the fabric, said there was no time for vanity in a house that served the Lord. But her hands remembered. They remembered how to stitch, how to mend, how to make something useful out of what had been broken. Jonas leaned back and watched her now, arms folded, not speaking, not instructing, just watching. His eyes didn't wander. They didn't linger where she didn't want them. They stayed on her work, quiet and steady, like he understood what it meant for someone like her to find stillness again. She didn't smile, but her breathing eased. The panic that had lived just under her skin since the night in Ash Hollow began to loosen its grip. Later, after the leather pouch was finished, Jonas tucked it into his satchel with a nod, and they ate beside the fire. She didn't speak much, neither did he. But something soft passed between them in the silence, something not loud enough to be love, but maybe the beginning of trust. That night, under a blanket stitched with her own trembling hands, Eloise dreamed for the first time in weeks. Not of fire or feathers, not of the preacher's son or the rope around her wrists, but of warmth. Of a home not yet found, but possible. Of a man who never asked her to change, and hands that still remembered how to make. The wagon lay broken at the base of the hill, its wheels splintered, the canvas torn like it had been clawed open by wind or violence or both. Flies buzzed thick in the air, and the scent of death clung to the grass like a warning. Eloise froze at the sight, her hand instinctively reaching for Jonas's arm. He said nothing, only nodded once before moving down the slope, his eyes scanning the ground, his steps quiet and careful. Two bodies lay near the wreck, man and woman, their faces pale and slack, mouths open to a sky that no longer held mercy. Eloise stepped over the broken spokes, her breath caught tight in her chest. She had seen death before, had felt its edge brush close, but this was different. This felt recent, fresh, like whatever had come for them might still be nearby. A wagon chest lay smashed, its contents scattered, flour, torn blankets, a wooden spoon bent at the handle. Something moved beneath a floorboard, barely a sound, more a shift of shadow than anything real. Jonas heard it too. He crouched low, pulled aside a splintered plank, and there, curled in the hollow like a cornered mouse, was a girl. No older than 6, her dress stained with dust and something darker, her hair tangled in knots. She stared up at Jonas with wide eyes, silent but shaking, her lips pressed tight like she'd been holding her breath for hours. He didn't speak. He just backed away slowly, giving space, then looked to Eloise. Eloise dropped to her knees, her voice soft as wind through wheat. "It's all right," she whispered. "You're safe now." The girl didn't move. Eloise reached a little closer, her hand open, not touching, just waiting. Minutes passed like that, slow and aching, until finally the girl inched forward. Her fingers wrapped around Eloise's wrist with surprising strength, and then she climbed into her arms, shaking, crying without sound. Eloise held her tight, rocking gently, her heart breaking in places she didn't know still had cracks left to open. She remembered being that small, that scared, screaming into the night with no one to hear. She remembered what it felt like when the world decided you weren't worth saving. Jonas stood back, arms folded, eyes fixed on the horizon. But when Eloise looked up at him, her cheek pressed to the girl's hair, she saw something in his face shift. Not surprise, not fear. Something quieter. He knelt beside them and brushed the dirt from the girl's knee. She didn't flinch. Maybe she needs two outcasts, he said, voice low, almost like he didn't mean to say it out loud. And for the first time since they met, Jonas smiled. It wasn't wide, and it didn't last long, but it was real. And Eloise felt something warm bloom in her chest, strange and unexpected, like hope trying to take root in soil, long left dry. They buried the parents near a cottonwood tree, marked the spot with a pile of stones, and when the girl finally spoke, her voice was barely there. "My name's Mercy." Eloise held her hand and whispered, "You're not alone now." And they left the hill behind together, 3 where there once were 2, walking into a world that still hurt, still hunted, but no longer faced alone. The road to Wren's Hollow was long and dry, a path beaten flat by wagon wheels and horse hooves, marked by brittle grass and the bones of animals that hadn't made it. Jonas walked ahead, Mercy in the middle, Eloise behind. The girl clutched a doll made of cloth and string that Eloise had stitched from scraps of her own dress. She didn't smile much, but she hadn't cried in 2 days, and that felt like a kind of miracle. When the town appeared on the horizon, it looked like a promise. Wooden roofs clustered together, a steeple poking into the sky, smoke curling from chimneys. Fences stretched around it, not the kind that kept livestock in, but the kind meant to keep something out. And near the entrance stood 2 men with rifles and badges, the glint of metal catching the last of the afternoon light. Eloise's heart lifted at first. Maybe they would have a warm meal, clean water, a bed softer than dirt. She stepped forward with Mercy's hand in hers, Jonas beside her, his eyes quiet, watchful. But the moment the guards saw him, their faces hardened. "Stop right there," one called out, raising his rifle slightly, not quite aiming, not quite idle. "We're just looking for shelter," Eloise said, keeping her voice calm, gentle. "Got a child with us. Been days on the road." The second man stepped closer, eyeing Jonas like he was a wild animal too close to the barn. "And what's he to you?" Eloise felt Mercy squeeze her hand, and she pulled the girl a little closer. "He's with us. He's helped us." The first guard spat in the dirt. His kind brought enough shame already. "We don't need more trouble." Jonas didn't move, didn't speak. His face didn't change, but Eloise saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he stood just a little straighter, as if he'd been through this 100 times and still never got used to it. "Please," Eloise tried again, her voice cracking now. "She's just a child." The sheriff had joined them now, a broad man with mean eyes and a smirk that didn't belong on a lawman's face. He looked Jonas over like someone judging the price of a mule, then turned to Eloise. "You want shelter? Drop him. We got no use for half-breeds here." Eloise's breath caught. Mercy hid her face against her side. Jonas stepped back before she could answer, nodding once, calm like always. "It's all right," he said, voice low. But it wasn't. It wasn't all right at all. They set up camp just beyond the fence line, near a cluster of boulders where the wind didn't bite so hard. Jonas made a small fire, more smoke than flame, just enough to warm the tin cup of beans Eloise stirred slowly. Mercy sat curled against her, her little fingers tangled in the hem of Eloise's shawl. As the stars blinked out one by one in the sky above, the girl began to cry. Soft at first, then harder, the kind of sobs that come from deep, from places too young to understand pain but too old to forget it. Eloise wrapped her arms around her and began to hum, then sing, an old lullaby her mother used to whisper on stormy nights. Voice thin but steady, the words more comfort than meaning. Jonas didn't speak, he just watched them from across the fire, his face lit by the glow, his eyes darker than night. And in that silence, Eloise sang until Mercy slept. And then, long after, she kept singing just for herself. The morning after Wren's Hollow, they walked without speaking. The silence didn't feel heavy, just stretched thin between them, worn from the night before. Mercy rode on Jonas's back, her arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried in the crook of his shoulder. She hadn't said much since the town turned them away, just clung tighter and tighter like she feared if she let go, the world might forget her too. They followed the edge of a dry creek bed, the sun climbing higher, the the sky cloudless and sharp. Eloise walked beside Jonas now, close enough to hear his breath, close enough to know something was weighing on him. He hadn't met her eyes since they broke camp, hadn't touched the small pouch of herbs he usually carried close. His hands were tight at his sides, like fists that had been held too long. Around midday they stopped in the shade of an overhang. Jonas helped Mercy down, gave her a strip of dried meat, and pointed to a patch of cool dirt where she could draw with a stick. She obeyed without question, her small hands already sketching crooked shapes into the earth. Jonas sat with his back to the stone, pulled off his hat, and rubbed at the line it left on his brow. His gaze stayed fixed on nothing, out toward the wide horizon, his mouth set in a line too firm for comfort. Eloise knelt beside him, tore a piece of bread and handed him half. He didn't take it at first, just stared at it like it was something too fine to be offered to him. "There's something I should tell you," he said finally, voice dry as sand. "You don't have to," she answered, but he shook his head. "I was part of a gang," he said, slow, like each word scraped its way out. "Not the kind folks whisper about with fear, but the kind they don't talk about at all. We didn't rob trains or stagecoaches. We moved through towns like shadows, took what we could, hid when it got hot. They found me when I was young, alone, hungry, half feral, and they gave me food, a coat, a name to hide behind." Eloise didn't speak. She just listened. They weren't kind, but they didn't care what I was, and that was more than I'd ever had. I stayed with them too long, thought maybe I belonged, until one night, we came across a family with a mule. Poor folks. Had nothing, and they killed all of them for the mule. He turned to her now, eyes dark but open. "I left that night. Didn't take food, didn't take boots, just walked. Never looked back." Eloise didn't flinch, didn't lower her eyes. She reached out, placed her hand on his knee, steady and sure. "You chose better," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, his throat moving as he swallowed the words he couldn't say. "So did you," he whispered. Behind them, Mercy hummed to herself, drawing a crooked sun in the dirt. And in that small silence, something settled between Eloise and Jonas. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but shared. And that made all the difference. The stars came out slow that night, one by one, shy at first, then bold against the dark. The fire crackled low between them, its light casting soft flickers on the stones and trees around their camp. Mercy lay curled in a blanket, her small form tucked between Eloise and Jonas, her breathing deep and even. A single lock of her hair fluttered with each exhale, and Eloise brushed it gently from her face, a motion more instinct than thought. Jonas sat cross-legged, whittling a branch with a small knife, the shavings falling at his boots like curled ribbons. He hadn't spoken much since supper, but that wasn't new. With Jonas, quiet was never cold. It was patient, watchful, the kind that gave you space to speak when you were ready. Eloise stared into the fire, her hands resting in her lap, fingers twitching with nerves. The heat from the flames warmed her skin, but inside, something colder stirred, something old and waiting to be said. She watched the way the light danced across Jonas's face, the sharp lines of his cheekbones, the curve of his mouth. There was no judgment there, no expectation, and that gave her courage. "I never told you what happened," she said softly. Jonas didn't look up, but his hand stopped moving. "In Ash Hollow," she continued, voice shaking just a little, "it wasn't because I stole or sinned or anything like that. It was the preacher's son. He followed me one night, said things, did worse. I went to the sheriff, told him everything, thought it would matter." The fire popped, spitting sparks into the air. Jonas didn't speak. "They called me a liar," she whispered, "said I was tempting him, said I was wicked, a stain on their perfect little town. So they dragged me into the square, tied me to a post, poured tar on my back, feathers over my shoulders like I was some animal, called it mercy that they didn't hang me." Still no word from Jonas, but he looked at her now, eyes steady, listening. She swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "I thought it would kill me," she said. Not just the pain, but the shame. The way they looked at me like I deserved it. Like I was less than dirt. Jonas set the knife down beside him. The firelight caught in his eyes, making them glow, not with anger, not with pity, but with something deeper, something like knowing. He leaned forward, just a little, his voice low, but firm. Then we burn their stories, he said, and build new ones. Eloise let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Her hands trembled, and she reached for his, uncertain at first, then sure. His fingers were rough, calloused, but warm. He didn't pull away, just held on, solid and calm, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Above them, the stars kept watching, and between their hands, something quiet and strong passed like a promise, not of safety, not of an easy road, but of truth. The kind you wrote yourself, in firelight and silence and the steady beat of two hearts that refused to be broken. The wind came hard from the north that morning, pulling at cloaks and coats, carrying dust and whispers alike. They were camped near a ridge, sun rising slow behind them, when a rider passed on the trail below. He didn't stop, just tipped his hat and kept moving, but his voice carried when Jonas asked where he was headed. Ash Hollow, the man called. Preacher's on his last breath. Town's got no shepherd now. The name hit Eloise like a stone dropped in still water. She hadn't heard it spoken in weeks, hadn't dared let her thoughts wander there, not even in dreams. But now it stirred something old, something sharp. Jonas said nothing at first, just glanced at her from the corner of his eye, waiting. That night, as Mercy slept bundled close between them, Jonas sat sharpening his knife, slow and methodical. The fire was low, almost shy, the way it flickered against the stone. We could go east, he said quietly. Find a place near the river, land that's good for planting. Eloise didn't answer right away. She watched the flames, her hands resting in her lap, her mind far from the warmth of the fire. Then she shook her head. Not hard, just enough. No, she said, not yet. Jonas looked up. I won't let them write the end of my story, she said. Not with lies, not with silence. He didn't argue, just nodded once, slow and solemn. He packed their things the next morning without a word. They traveled light, just one horse between them now, Mercy riding in front, Eloise behind, arms wrapped tight around the child's waist. Jonas rode ahead on foot, leading them across dry creek beds and narrow trails. The land was quieter than Eloise remembered. The trees stood thinner, the sky wider. But every step toward Ash Hollow made her blood stir, not with fear, but with fire. When they reached the edge of town, dusk had already dipped the rooftops in gold. The chapel bell was silent. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but no one lingered on porches. Even the dogs seemed to bark softer now. Eloise dismounted slowly, lifting Mercy down and brushing the dust from her coat. She looked at the child's face, then at Jonas's. They both waited for her to say something. I'm not here to beg, she said, and I'm not hiding. Jonas gave a quiet nod. Then we walk. And they did, through the main road, past the general store, past the steps where she'd once sat with scraped knees and a hymnal in her lap. People stared. One man dropped his tobacco pipe. A woman pulled her child inside, but no one spoke. They walked all the way to the church steps. The same post still stood in the square, weathered and gray, the one they'd tied her to, the one that still bore faint stains of tar. Eloise stepped up to it, laid her hand against the wood, and stood tall. She hadn't come back to be forgiven. She'd come back to be seen. The square looked smaller than she remembered. The buildings hadn't changed much. Same chipped shutters, same leaning sign above the general store. But the weight of memory made everything feel tighter, like the sky itself leaned closer, waiting to see what she'd do. Eloise stood with Mercy beside her, and Jonas just behind, his shadow stretching long in the morning sun. They had walked through the town without drawing weapons, without raising voices, but their silence had spoken louder than any gunshot. Whispers followed them like wind. People peeked through curtains, whispered behind hands, stared from doorways with wide eyes and lips pressed thin. A stone hit the ground near her feet, skittering across the dust. Another followed, this one striking her ankle. It didn't hurt. Not really. She didn't flinch. A man muttered "witch" under his breath, but when she met his eyes, he looked down, shame blooming on his face like a bruise. She walked slowly, each step deliberate. Mercy clung to her hand, eyes wide but unafraid, her small legs trying to match Eloise's stride. Jonas walked steady behind them, his face unreadable, but his presence, firm like a mountain, had taken up root behind her. He carried nothing but his knife at his belt, untouched. Near the well, a woman stepped forward, older now, hair silvering at the edges. She clutched a cloth bundle and held it out with shaking hands. Eloise recognized her. Mary Ellen Graff. She used to bring her baby to the chapel steps, when Eloise helped with feedings and stories. That baby, now a girl of maybe 9, stood beside her mother, eyes wide and curious. "I don't believe what they said," Mary Ellen whispered, pressing the bread into Eloise's hands. "I never did." Eloise nodded once, not sure what to say, and moved on. She reached the center of the square, the very spot where they had tied her to the post, where tar had soaked her skin and feathers stuck to her tears. The post was still there, sun-bleached and split. She turned to face the town. Faces stared from all corners now. Men with hard mouths, women with arms crossed, and a few, just a few, with heads bowed. She stepped up onto the edge of the well and stood taller than them all. "I didn't come back to beg," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear and steady. "I didn't come to curse you either." No one moved. Even the wind held its breath. "I came to tell the truth," she continued. "Your preacher's son forced himself on me. I told you. I begged you to listen. You didn't. You tied me up. You smeared me in tar. You tried to break me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few turned away, ashamed. "I lived," Eloise said. "I lived because this man behind me stood by me when no one else would." She turned slightly, and Jonas stepped forward beside her, not speaking, not needing to. He stood like a shield, quiet and proud. "I was not your shame," she said. "You were mine." And for the first time, no one had the courage to throw another stone. They left Ash Hollow before the preacher was buried. No farewells, no need. They had not returned to belong, only to speak. And once the truth was laid bare in the square, there was nothing left to hold them there. But as they rode out, Mercy asleep against Eloise's chest, and Jonas silent beside her, people watched. Not with hatred this time, not with fear, but something quieter, curiosity maybe, or the first slow turn toward understanding. A few men tipped their hats. One woman even placed a jar of honey in their saddlebag without a word. They didn't stop to thank her, but Jonas looked back once, and Eloise swore she saw something ease in his shoulders. They followed the river south, letting the land decide their pace. The hills grew softer, the trees taller, birds returned to the sky, and the nights were no longer cold enough to make their teeth chatter. Mercy began to laugh again, chasing frogs and picking wildflowers, her small voice rising like music across the fields. She called Jonas Papa for the first time without warning, while he helped her gather wood near the clearing they chose for their home. He didn't correct her, just lifted her onto his shoulders and carried her back, like it had always been that way. Eloise found a patch of earth near the creek, rich and dark, and planted sunflower seeds she'd saved from a trade post weeks earlier. She knelt in the dirt every morning, pressing her fingers into the soil, whispering to the seeds like they were old friends. The first sprouts came fast, green shoots reaching like they knew they were welcome. By summer, they stretched taller than she could reach, their golden heads bobbing in the breeze. Jonas built a cabin with his own hands, strong and simple, with a roof that didn't leak and a door that never needed to be locked. He carved Mercy a stool to sit by the hearth and a whistle shaped like a bird that made her laugh until she hiccuped. Eloise wove curtains from cloth they'd bartered for, and filled the shelves with jars of herbs, buttons, bits of ribbon, and stones Mercy collected on their walks. In the afternoons, they fished in the creek. At night, They read by lamplight, old books left behind by travelers, stories of places they might never see but didn't need to, because everything they wanted was already here. One morning, Eloise caught her reflection in the water. She paused, surprised. Her face was sun-kissed, her hair wild and tangled, her cheeks smudged with soil and ash from the morning's fire. A faint scar still curled beneath her jaw, and another ran along her shoulder where the tar had once burned. But her eyes were steady, her mouth curved in a smile she hadn't known she still had. She touched her reflection, laughed softly, and thought, maybe this is what pride looks like. Not polished, not perfect, just honest. And as Mercy ran through the flowers, her arms spread wide like wings, and Jonas stood nearby, carving a frame for their doorway, Eloise turned back toward the home they'd built, and knew, without doubt, it was theirs. All of it. Every stone, every scar, every bloom. Theirs. If this story moved you, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of courage, justice, and redemption.